through the evening. They'll slowly start to fade, certainly across parts of East Anglia and the southeast, and for parts of the Midlands, southwest England, not too many showers overnight. The showers also easing across northeast Scotland, but we'll keep some elsewhere. Temperatures dropping down into single figures even in towns and cities. So a coolish start to another showery day on Tuesday. Again, the showers will develop across pretty much all areas. Again, some of them could be quite heavy, and again, they'll be fairly slow moving. I suspect, though, parts of southwest Wales, southwest England, not seeing too many showers. Certainly by the afternoon, looking largely dry here with some sunny spells. At the same time, a lot of cloud for Northern Ireland and plenty of heavy showers across eastern England. Again on the cool side, but with a bit more sunshine in the southwest, 17, 18, possibly 19 Celsius. Still, the showers keep going as we head through Tuesday evening and into Wednesday, and we'll keep a fair few showers during Wednesday, and that's how it's looking as we lead into the big weekend, of course, the Jubilee weekend. So likely to still be a few showers around at first, but overall the weather trends becoming drier and warmer for the Jubilee. Goodbye.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we need to be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and no one will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is political commentator Benedict Spence, and here's what we've got coming up on the show. Government plans to scrap EU laws and harness the benefits of Brexit at last. But is the move little more than a political ploy to improve the PM's popularity? And calls for answers over the disturbing scenes at the Champions League final after French police fired pepper spray and tear gas at fans. And the return of pounds, ounces, inches and feet as the government pushes to reintroduce imperial measurements. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you need to talk about? Email me gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me @gbnews. First though, it's time for GB News headlines.
A very good afternoon to you. It's just 1 minute past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The French Interior Minister says massive and industrial-scale fraud regarding tickets is what's to blame for the chaotic scenes at the Champions League final in Paris on Saturday. Violence outside the stadium led to English and Liverpool fans being tear-gassed by French police. French authorities say that out of the 29 people arrested around the stadium, more than half are British citizens. More than 100 people were arrested in the suburb. Boris Johnson has urged UEFA to launch a formal investigation into what went wrong. The Minister for Tech and Digital Economy, Phillips, told GB News a quick investigation was crucial.
Deeply concerned. I've seen those video pictures showing Liverpool fans, children, disabled fans as well, getting pepper sprayed by the French police for no apparent reason. I am deeply, deeply concerned about that. The policing by the French police does look heavy-handed, and that's why it's important to get this UEFA inquiry underway as quickly as possible to urgently find out what really happened.
Conservative former Minister Jeremy Wright is calling for Boris Johnson to resign due to what he's calling the real and lasting damage of Partygate. It comes after Downing Street refused to deny that a second gathering took place on the evening of Boris Johnson's birthday in June 2020. Well, a report in the Sunday Times claims that details of the alleged event may have been edited out of the Sue Gray report. The Cabinet Office disputes that version of events. Well, Labour MP Christian Wakeford told GB News any undue pressure put on Sue Gray would be highly inappropriate.
There were further questions about parties that supposedly haven't been investigated, either by the Met or by Sue Gray herself, which suggests, again, that Number 10 isn't truly forthcoming with a lot of this information. It does reek that of a lot of attempts at cover-up.
Coal-fired power plants, which were due to close later this year, may need to stay open now to provide backup electricity this winter. A government spokesperson says the decision is due to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and major disruptions to the flow of Russian gas. The price of the cheapest pasta in UK supermarkets has risen by 50% in the year since April 2021. The analysis from the Office for National Statistics also says the price of bread and minced beef went up by 16%. It's as inflation hit a 40-year high. Downing Street says it's set to ditch 350 European Union rules. Number 10 says their new procurement bill will rip up hundreds of complicated and bureaucratic regulations and instead replace them with a single framework for securing public sector contracts. The bill, which will make it easier to exclude suppliers who are underperforming and also to bring in new competition processes for emergency buying, is expected to become law next year. Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Steve Barclay, says the reforms will help to improve public services. The Spanish Prime Minister says NATO's support for Ukraine is unbreakable and that Russian President Vladimir Putin will not reach his objectives. Russian forces are advancing in Severodonetsk, the largest city that Kyiv still partly controls in the eastern Luhansk region. President Zelensky says that around 90% of the buildings are damaged and that there's no telecommunications in the city. Well, meanwhile, the UK's Ministry of Defence says Russia's fighting forces are experiencing poor morale and discipline problems amid reports of mutinies. The winners of the Eurovision Song Contest have raised over £710,000 for Ukraine's military by selling their trophy. A wave of public support saw the Kalisz Orchestra triumph with their entry, Stefania. The winners sold their crystal microphone in a Facebook auction. The money raised will be used to buy unmanned aerial system for the armed forces. Now, a man disguised as an elderly woman in a wheelchair has thrown cake at the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci's painting was unharmed at the Louvre in Paris, but the attack left a smear of white cream on the portrait's protective glass. The perpetrator was wearing a wig and lipstick, called on people to think of the earth as he was led away from the scene. This is GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head to Alex for We Need to Talk About.
Brexit? You ain't seen nothing yet. Because when we finally left the EU, we transposed all of their rules and regs, over 150,000 of the things, into British statute. So we didn't face gaping holes in our own rule books and operational anarchy. But we did lay the foundations to bin them as we see fit. Well, finally, our newfound sovereignty, having been stuck on the shelf for 2 years of plague, is finally being dusted off and cranked up. A new 5-year expiry date for 1,500 pieces of the most egregious bits of legislation will force ministers to engage brain for British business and build bespoke bonfires to burn Brussels' burdensome regulation. Sounds great, but it does mean relying on the notoriously Remainery quangocracy running Whitehall to take a strimmer to the forest of rules for root and branch reform. While even at the top, certain levers banned by Brussels haven't been yanked in the country's favour, like cutting VAT on fuel bills or cutting corporation tax to grow the economy. So, as Boris looks to build a legacy of something other than almost dying of COVID while his staff got boozed up at work while spending cash like a Saudi prince, Britain waits to see what Brexit baubles will be hung on the magic money tree. Well, who better to discuss this announcement than former Conservative Minister and doyen of Brexit, Anne Widdecombe. And fantastic to have you on the programme. Music, I no doubt, to your ears, but do you have much faith that this is going to be the Brexit that we all voted for?
Well, I won't have faith in that until the Northern Ireland situation is sorted out. But this is certainly, I think, a huge step along the way if it really is delivered. I mean, we always said one of the benefits of Brexit would be that we would be free of EU bureaucracy and unnecessary laws and petty regulations. And we said all of that. And it hasn't really been delivered because, as you observe, we've been preoccupied with COVID. So I will withhold judgment until I've seen exactly how much and how quickly they're going to do it. But I'm very pleased. I mean, I think this is something we've all been waiting to hear.
And do you think that this will sharpen people's attention to delivering on some of the benefits of Brexit by setting sunset clauses? So in 5 years' time, the regulation in our statute books essentially comes to an end and the gap needs to be filled.
Indeed. And of course, I'm sure it's crossed all our minds. We don't know who's going to be in power in 5 years' time. And we don't know what their attitude towards this is going to be. So I would say quicker the better. Quicker the better.
There are a lot of Brexit dividends that perhaps people like you and I would have liked to have been cashed in by now, like cutting VAT on fuel, something I mentioned in my opening, or really taking, a knife to some of the tax that's being placed on business, something we can do outside of EU competition regulation. Why do you think the government has been so hesitant to cash in big on Brexit?
I've been very disappointed. I mean, this government has approached everything with a sort of high tax, high spend attitude, which frankly is what we've always associated with Labour. Whereas I think we should have gone for stimulating growth in the economy, like Thatcher did, by cutting taxes rather than raising them. And I'm with you. We've been hidebound as far as VAT goes because we've been members of the European community. Well, now we're free. We can do what we like with VAT, and yet we're not doing it. And we're not creating Singapore on Thames, if you like. We're not sort of stimulating business to come here and thrive and know that this will be a deregulated, low-tax economy, which is what attracts business. We haven't done any of that. I don't understand it. Even COVID doesn't excuse complete inaction on those fronts.
We have seen a few sort of green shoots of sovereignty, though. We have essentially got rid of a lot of Brussels regulation on research and innovation, especially in things like genetic engineering of crops. We've heard today that imperial measures are no longer going to be banned. But are these things sort of two fussy little bits around the edges rather than really putting meat on the bones of Brexit?
Well, I mean, there is serious stuff and there is essentially trivial stuff. I'm glad we've got the Crown mark back on our pint glasses. I mean, I never acknowledged the right of the EU to take those away. So I'm glad we've got that. Glad we've got it for the Jubilee. Glad that people can, if they really want to, sell in pounds and ounces. Very glad about it all. But that is not what is going to transform the country and really give us the big Brexit dividends. The big Brexit dividends will come from the sorts of things I've already been talking about, reducing burden on business, stimulating the economy, making the most of our freedoms to set our own taxes in regard to VAT. Until we've done all of that, really it's just tinkering around the edges. But nevertheless, I'm pleased, if somebody wants to sell their potatoes in pounds, I still talk in pounds. I don't know what shopkeepers think of me, particularly the younger ones, but I still do talk in pounds. I still think when I'm buying material in terms of feet and yards. I don't think in terms of these things called meters. The younger generation is exactly the opposite. So I think this is tinkering around the edges. What we need to see are the big, bold measures, which should be very, very Johnson-esque. They should be just what Boris wants to do. This is the man who ordered all those vaccines before they'd even been approved, never mind produced. This was Boris, really the buccaneering Boris. And we need that now to get a real stimulus for the economy. We're not seeing it.
I mean, there are a lot of people saying that, well, this has just been rolled out to distract everyone from Partygate. But, could you look at that in a different way and sort of say, well, perhaps Partygate is a great opportunity now for the Prime Minister to really set his legacy by making the sort of bold moves you're talking about?
Well, I only wish he would. But I think we're going to hear for a long time now, any time the government does anything at all, they're going to say, oh, it's distracting from Partygate. It's already gone on far too long. If I've got a beef about the way this government has handled Partygate, it's that they've let the whole thing drag out. And it still will be dragging out because we've got to decide now if Boris, broke the ministerial code and lied to the House of Commons and all the rest of it. This should have all been done, tied up in a couple of months, not dragging on this long. He hasn't got a grip on it.
Now, we were told, weren't we, and we got very used to hearing that the heavens were going to fall in if we voted to leave the EU, and guess what? They didn't. But there are still people there who'll point to certain things and say, well, that is the fault of Brexit. When we had a shortage of lorry drivers, for instance, the fact that we do have slow growth now, the mess going on in Northern Ireland. Have there been downsides, do you think, from leaving the EU?
Well, as far as the lorry drivers go, let's forget that we had 47,000 HGV tests held up and in a queue at DVLA, and therefore people couldn't drive lorries because they didn't have the licences, they hadn't passed the tests. It was nothing to do with the EU, or there was only a very marginal amount that was to do with the EU. A few thousand lorry drivers didn't return after Brexit, but there were 47,000 stacked in a queue. So I think people have been very quick and ready to blame Brexit, either deliberately or just because they're not thinking properly, for absolutely everything that's gone wrong. Now, as far as Northern Ireland goes, and that is the big one for me, it isn't Brexit that it's to blame. It's the deal that is to blame. And you and I will know that the Brexit party shouted our heads off about the iniquity of that deal. And we were told, don't worry, we've got a year of trade negotiations. And in that year, all this will be sorted out. And that was based on an assumption that the EU were going to be reasonable, that it was in their interests to be reasonable. They already shouted from the rooftops that they were going to punish us for leaving in order to deter other member states doing it. They'd already said that they wanted to make it as difficult as possible. Why did Boris or anybody else assume they would be reasonable? And my belief still is that if the price of a deal was what's happened in Northern Ireland, we should have gone without a deal.
And the EU hardly really showering themselves in glory at the moment, meeting again today for the 6th time to discuss sanctions against Russia. They just can't seem to get their act together, making a case, one might say, for why national sovereignty is a far better option.
Well, I mean, I think the case is very decidedly made. I think it's going to be a very long time before the EU itself starts to realise that. It'll need more countries leaving before they do. But I think certainly there's no such thing as national sovereignty within the EU. I found that. I was a government minister for 7 years, and I discovered in that time that we couldn't actually make our own laws unless the EU said yes, that if the EU wanted to pass law, we had to tug our forelocks and implement it. And so, I've never thought that Britain was sovereign since that time. And now we are. And we should be making the very most of it. That is what we should now be doing. And we should be saying, we are free. Here are the benefits of being free. Now, I don't think Boris has got too long to do that before people get very fed up and say, well, what was the purpose of getting Brexit done if we're not actually getting post-Brexit stuff done?
You know, as a former government minister, did you ever find yourself pushing up against sort of, a belligerent mindset in Whitehall of people who didn't want to do as you instructed? And are you worried, perhaps, that the Remainers who allegedly make up a lot of the human resource in government departments might be a little less inclined to play ball when it comes to the sunset clauses on some of these regulations?
It was a very different civil service when I was a minister. Don't forget that was the mid-90s when I ceased to be a minister. It was with the incoming Blair government. It was a very different civil service. Yes, there were a lot of Sir Humphreys, if I can put it that way, but the ethos was still very much, if this is what ministers want, this is what we try to deliver. Now, I think today's civil service doesn't operate like that at all. I think there is a lot of entitlement to resist, if you like. People thinking that the ministers have got it wrong, the ministers are darn nuisances, they're here today and gone tomorrow. We, the civil servants, know much better than all of them. And there is now quite a resistance. Now, whether it's Remainer resistance or any other sort of resistance, I mean, look at the Rwanda resistance, which we've encountered in the course of that policy. I think, yes, today's civil service is different, and you might get a lot of resistance, but it will be up to individual secretaries of state to cut through that, and the measure of them as secretaries of state will be whether they can. I mean, if you look back to the days of Ken Clarke, I mean, big Remainer, but apart from that, if you look back to the days of Ken Clarke, Education Reform Act, privatisation of the prisons, health service reform, wherever he went, he drove against immense resistance. He drove through big reforms. Well, if today's secretaries of state are so feeble that they can't do that, they shouldn't be in the position.
Wise words indeed. Anne Widdecombe, I've missed you, Anne. Always lovely catching up with you. Well, I'm going to go now to political commentator and writer Benedict Spence, who's with me in the studio today. Benedict, 1,500 regulations. Oh, it sounds like a lot until you learn there's about 150,000 of them in total. Is this going to be a big slashing of red tape or twiddling with ribbons?
I mean, I think it'll be twiddling with ribbons ultimately, because as you point out, there is an awful lot of red tape that you sort of have to extract yourself from, and just because you get rid of a few doesn't necessarily mean that you can get rid of the whole lot. It's also not entirely practical to get rid of it all in one go just for the sake of going, fantastic, we're going to have a bonfire. Maybe we shouldn't have set fire to that one thing. Oh no, everything's been set on fire now. We haven't got a law for this, that and the other. It does take time. It's complicated. But I do agree with that. It's a funny thing, actually, to have a government that wants to play up its sort of pro-Brexit credentials. It's got Brexit done, and now it's going to follow through from that. But it doesn't necessarily have the personality or the character to really act on that and to make the most of it. The other thing, of course, is, pandemic or no pandemic, we have been out of the European Union now for some time. And it does seem to be very often the case that when things aren't going right for the government on something completely unrelated to Brexit, that it springs forward, we're going to do something to do with, moving on from Brexit thing, but as if that's going to win round the public to remind us all of its pro-Brexit credentials. That often seems to be the way with Boris Johnson. He has this little sort of, in case of fire, break glass, little Brexit box in the office. It just goes, right, send this press release to the press. Fantastic, we're going to get rid of something to do with Brexit. What are the actual tangible benefits? Well, we've got a government that's got the highest tax burden in sort of living memory. Efforts to sort of reform immigration, for example, haven't gone particularly well. You are sort of looking around and saying, what actually has this government done that's been so fantastic? It brought back blue passports. Wunderbar. Fantastic. What actually does that do other than make a few people feel very good and a few very vocal people feel very bad? Not very much. We are waiting to see the benefits of Brexit. I don't think that's because Brexit wasn't a good thing. I was a Brexiteer. I think it's because actually we don't have a government that necessarily has an idea or a vision for the country, and that is reflected in the fact that it responds to every disaster by pumping out money, giving lots of money to people and raising taxes.
Yeah, we've got a government that seems to have forgotten how to govern, some might say.
It doesn't know that it's Conservative, that's for a start.
Benedict, thank you ever so much. Well, you're with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, the UK urges UEFA to investigate the actions of French police at Saturday's Champions League final. We'll be discussing that next.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
In scenes that Liverpool fans would find harrowing following the Hillsborough Stadium disaster that saw 97 supporters crushed to death and 766 injured at a match in 1989. Kick-off at the Champions League final between Liverpool and Real Madrid in Paris on Saturday had to be delayed by over half an hour due to safety concerns. There were scenes of chaos as security checks created bottlenecks and riot police fired pepper spray and tear gas at fans waiting to get in, including children and the elderly. One fan was seen holding his ticket up, waiting to enter the stadium, only to be gassed by the French gendarme, kitted out like RoboCop on the other side of the fence. It was the English fans' fault, claimed France's sports minister, with the country hosting next year's Rugby World Cup and the 2024 Olympics being called into question. Even French media called the pandemonium a national embarrassment. Eyewitness accounts repeatedly indicate many of those jumping barriers were not wearing the Liverpool strip. Fake tickets have been blamed by UEFA and the late arrival of fans. Two more excuses dismissed by onlookers, who said the bedlam began many hours before. But it's easy to blame English fans following recent hullabaloo at stadiums here, with supporters storming the pitch and actual fisticuffs between them, managers and players. The beautiful game is starting to look very ugly indeed. Well, let's speak now to sports broadcaster and writer Aidan McGee. Aidan, it's a bit like they say one thing in France, they say one thing in UEFA, but people there are saying, no, this smells of a cover-up. What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's eerily reminiscent of what happened at Hillsborough, actually, when I see people looking through bars trying to plead for help. I mean, this time, OK, it's tickets to get into the game. They're not pleading for dear life as they were in 1989. But to draw parallels in terms of the behaviour of Liverpool fans compared to what happened in 89 and obviously at Highsall in 85, I mean, the number of people who attended those matches in 85 and 89 on Saturday evening will probably number in the hundreds. It's not a fair comparison. In terms of, I mean, to me, when I heard the statements on Saturday, the fans had arrived a bit late. Well, that turned out to be not true because all the footage from 3 hours before shows that they were present and correct. The other thing is that if you're arriving at the ground and you are ticketless, well, that's a failure in your police operation anyway on behalf of the French, because nearly every final that I've been to, in fact, every match over 50,000, even in this country, possibly even abroad as well, you have a filtering mechanism up to a mile away from the stadium. So you're not allowed to get near the perimeter of the stadium without coming through airport-style security checks sometime. When I was in South Africa, for example, at the World Cup in 2010, security was a huge issue, Alex, and it was massively on the agenda. And even at the Confederations Cup the year before, which is a dry run for the tournament, I was actually subjected to airport-style security. I had to prove that my diabetic pen was for medicinal purposes only until someone actually came over and said, oh, actually, no, he's diabetic, it's best not to make him inject, otherwise you're going to be picking him up. I look round, and my hire car is up on a quick-fit style frame being checked for devices. So if they were doing that in 2010, it doesn't need to be that draconian now, but at least ask fans and say, have you got your tickets? Another problem, and I spoke to someone a few hours ago who was right in the thick of it on Saturday evening. He said another issue was that those filtering mechanisms wouldn't have worked anyway because the QR codes weren't working on the tickets. So if there were counterfeit tickets, it's because of an operational problem on behalf of the French authorities and UEFA. The QR codes weren't working, the holograms weren't working, and neither were the barcodes. So it was, in theory, possible to copy a ticket. But then we had the situation afterwards where Andy Robertson, Liverpool Scotland international, said, well, I gave away my tickets to my family and friends, and they're gilt-edged tickets, Alex. They're issued to players only. They're the most gilt-edged tickets inside that stadium that you can possibly get. And he said that when his relatives and friends showed these tickets at the perimeter, they were told that they were counterfeit, and they weren't counterfeit at all. So all in all, and you have to remember as well, there's a culture this year in the French League of hooliganism. Is hooliganism almost reminiscent of how it was in this country back in the 80s when it was known as the English disease, and it was the worst of all British exports, going abroad, fans going to national tournaments and causing mayhem. Problems last night at Saint-Etienne, problems throughout the season with Marseille, problems with Lyon as well. And this has not been seen before, and I think the default reaction of the French police was to just fight. And you saw how they're dressed. There's no smile and a wink as you get from the bobbies around Wembley. They've learnt that adversarial, confrontational policing does not work, especially when you've got fans who know they should be there, they know they've got a ticket, and they should be allowed entry. They've travelled through hell and high water, even allowing for the fact that EasyJet cancelled 200 flights from Liverpool in the northwest to stop fans, well, not to stop fans getting there, but it didn't help with the transportation of fans to Paris. So all in all, so I should say as well, the allocation of the tickets as well. If you have an 80,000-seater stadium and 20,000 fans of Madrid have got tickets, 20,000 to Liverpool, and you've got 40,000 in the middle going to sponsors and the football family, whoever they are. I've never met a member of the football family. And so you're going to create an insatiable demand for tickets. Is it sensible to then invite 60,000 Liverpool fans there? We saw it 2 weeks ago. Seville had 100,000 Rangers fans, 100,000 Eintracht Frankfurt fans in Seville. Now, yes, it's a good festival. Those cities love taking the money. They love taking our dollar for when they drink the place dry, but they don't like dealing with the repercussions afterwards when people can't get in. So all in all, a complete failure on about 7 or 8 different points, but don't expect, with UEFA inextricably linked to the European Union and the Council of Europe, don't expect either the French government, the French police or UEFA to give English fans a fair hearing today, because that simply won't happen.
Yeah, what's your take, Benedict? Same sort of thing?
I mean, what's quite funny is that afterwards it turns out that there were problems at the Real Madrid end as well. The problem was they just didn't send as many police down that way. They still had issues with the tickets and not enough gates open. Another thing that's not being discussed is when the French Interior Minister came out, Sports Minister rather, came out initially and said it was ticketless fans that was the problem. It turns out ticketless fans were the problem, but not Liverpool or Real Madrid fans. It was local youths from the Saint-Denis area who were trying to break down barriers, getting in, and in some cases, what we've seen from video footage on social media, because the idiots filmed themselves doing it, friendly security guards letting them in whilst stopping legitimate fans from getting in as well. So you've got that sort of slightly bizarre situation where you have the French congratulating themselves on a wonderful policing operation and blaming the English hooligans because that's very easy. You also have a number of Real Madrid fans turning around and going, well, it wasn't exactly great down our end either. You then have the really nasty issue after the final had finished, where gangs of the same people that were breaking into the stadium mugged fans from both sides, and the police didn't actually intervene, even though it was quite clear a lot of these individuals were known to the local authorities. So you've just got an incredibly nasty situation. I think Real Madrid can pass it off as, well, we've won, it's not been quite so bad down our end. But if you are a Liverpool fan, I mean, as Aidan says, you've got the legacy of Hillsborough and the legacy also of authorities closing ranks and saying, nope, nothing to do with us, all your fault. You can't get away with that in this country anymore because they fought very hard to stop that. But clearly on the continent, they still feel that that's an acceptable response.
I mean, I said earlier that France is going to be hosting the Rugby World Cup next year, the Olympics after that. These are huge international events, and Macron pushed hard to get the Champions League final moved to Paris from Russia. But, I mean, I have to say it, there'll be people at home probably thinking it's a problem with football, isn't it? You don't get scenes like that at rugby. You don't get scenes like that at the Olympics. You get that at football.
But these are the... Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do, and I will always defend football, Alex. I really will. But it's the allocation of the fans. These are tickets, which is a problem. It's also these events are much bigger than Rugby World Cup finals. You're not going to get 100,000 England fans going to Paris if England play a Rugby World Cup final there. You might get 10,000 or something like that. But the allocation has to be right. There's also a historical perspective on this as well, Alex. That stadium in Stade de France was built in 1998 for the 98 World Cup. It was built in an impoverished area at the time, suburb north of Paris in Saint-Denis. France won the World Cup that year. It was the Rainbow World Cup victory. Vieira was from Senegal. Diokayev was from Armenia. There was Desailly was from Ghana. You had Lizarazu from Spain. It was a rainbow collective victory, and it was meant to engulf and bring the whole of France together. Saint-Denis is a really, really rough and impoverished area. Those people around there don't feel part of it. They've grown up with this massive stadium there. They see these huge blue-chip events coming there every few months, and no wonder they're knocking on the table, knocking on the windows outside, wondering what's going on in there. It's been nothing but... It's just a jamboree, and people who are living around there need to be brought in and be made to feel part of it, and then you won't see those flashpoints, because the local youths get involved in trouble on match days, whether it be rugby, football, Olympics or whatever. It's not a new thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's right, actually, isn't he? We were discussing this earlier, that Paris, far from, the Eiffel Tower and the scenes of romance we see, is actually a bit gnarly.
Yeah, everybody who ever goes there these days say that it's not what it used to be, the idyll in the 90s, and it is, a very impoverished part. If you're not in the exact city centre, it's, it's significantly worse than boroughs of London and stuff like that in terms of crime or anything like that. But also, again, something else that's been slightly bothering me is this idea, because some people have been trying to do this, saying that this always seems to happen whenever Liverpool go to a big final. This is a very key thing. Liverpool are vast. Real Madrid are vast as well, but Liverpool are huge. You get tens of thousands, whatever city they go to. It happens in the UK, if they go abroad, they attract a huge amount of people. So you're always going to attract a certain amount of tension when that happens. And, without having to sound slightly flippant, Liverpool end up playing in a lot more cup finals than most clubs can even dream of. So you're always going to get more of a spotlight being shone on them. And it's very toxic, I think, to see some members of the British press, some commentators, trying to suggest that this is a Liverpool problem. Yeah. It's not.
They've had lots of different... they've been travelling abroad for 30 or 40 years. Yeah. The number of times you can count flashpoints are on one hand.
Guys, thank you so much. I don't follow football, but I've been pretty horrified by some of the scenes that I saw over the weekend. Really interesting to discuss it. You're with GB News on TV and DAB radio. Coming up, heavy fighting continues in the east of Ukraine as Russian troops advance in the Donbass. We'll be getting the latest live from Kharkiv. First, though, it's time for a check on the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 2:33. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The French Interior Minister has blamed massive and industrial-scale ticket fraud for the chaotic scenes at the Champions League final in Paris on Saturday. Well, violence outside the stadium led to English fans, in the main Liverpool fans, being tear-gassed by French police. French authorities say that out of the 29 people arrested around the stadium, more than half were British citizens. They add more than 100 were arrested in the suburb. Conservative former Attorney General Jeremy Wright is calling for Boris Johnson to resign due to what he's calling the real and lasting damage of Partygate. Well, Downing Street have refused to deny that a second gathering took place on the evening of Boris Johnson's birthday in June 2020. Coal-fired power plants, which were due to close later this year, may need to stay open to provide backup electricity this winter. A government spokesperson says the decision is due to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and major disruptions to the flow of Russian gas. The Times newspaper is reporting as many as 6 million households could face power cuts if President Putin cuts off more supplies to the EU. Downing Street say they're set to ditch 350 European Union rules. Number 10 says their new procurement bill will rip up hundreds of complicated and bureaucratic regulations and replace them instead with a single framework for securing public sector contracts. The bill's expected to become law next year. Northern Ireland's Parliament has failed to elect a new Speaker. 2 nominees for the role, representing the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP, failed to secure the necessary cross-community support. The Democratic Unionist Party has refused to back the election of a Speaker as part of its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Sinn Féin Vice President Michelle O'Neill says her party will keep having the Assembly recalled until a new Speaker is elected. A man disguised as an elderly woman in a wheelchair has thrown cake at the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci's painting was unharmed at the Louvre in Paris, but the attack left a smear of white cream on the portrait's protective glass. The perpetrator was wearing a wig and lipstick, called on people to think of the earth as he was led away from the scene. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now we'll head back shortly to Alex for We Need to Talk About.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
The brutality of war has been on haunting display following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As you may expect, some of the content we're about to discuss might be distressing for some viewers. Reports today of rotting corpses as the weather warms up, with relentless shelling in the Donbass as Putin's troops double down on seizing territory in the east, while prisoners from the Mariupol steelworks in the south are allegedly being tortured with pliers, strangled and electrocuted. Meanwhile, French and German leaders held talks with Volodymyr Zelensky over the weekend, who is running out of patience with the two nations continuing to import fuel from Russia, as the EU meets today for the 6th time to again discuss the divided and dismal response. Meanwhile, Germany has predictably reneged on its promise to send heavy weaponry to Ukraine, while some pitiless EU leaders have even intimated handing Russia chunks of Ukrainian territory, something President Zelensky compared to the appeasement of Nazi Germany. History has a funny way of repeating itself. Britain, supported by America, is once again wading into a conflict on the continent and doubling down on dealing with danger, while weak-willed Western Europeans wish only to capitulate. Freelance journalist Stefan Weichert is in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine and joins me now. Stefan, we're hearing harrowing reports of extremely intense fighting. What is the latest?
Well, the latest is that the Russian soldiers are pushing really, really hard on the Severodonetsk, as you mentioned. They're trying to encircle a large amount of Ukrainian soldiers who are in the city and trying to get control of the full Luhansk region. And we are hearing reports that evacuations of civilians is continuing going on. And during that evacuation process, reportedly a French journalist also lost his life today. It's very fierce fighting where the Ukrainians keep defending, but where we hear that the Russians are making slow progress.
Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russia essentially wants to completely wipe parts of eastern Ukraine off the map and is extremely frustrated. He has called for heavy weaponry, whatever he can get his hands on, to push back against the Russians. But it seems to me that appetite from certain European nations to help Ukraine is beginning to fade.
Yes, it does look like that. And I think that's the really big frustration here from Ukrainians is to say that, well, we're seeing this about how the Russians are completely destroying the cities as they're moving on. We are hearing that civilians are getting hit, schools, universities, hospitals, kindergartens getting shelled. And there is just no understanding here among the Ukrainian known population and the leadership to understand why. Why are some of the European leaders, like the German Chancellor and the French President, not doing more?
And we heard over the course of Davos last week various senior figures, including Henry Kissinger, former Foreign Secretary in the United States, suggesting there could be discussions of a ceasefire. You've had Olaf Scholz saying, well, we need to find a peaceful resolution. You don't fight fighting with more fighting. But this must spell disaster to the ears of President Zelensky when he is steadfast in defending his country.
Yes, you're right. I mean, on one side, Zelensky knows that the fighting is really, really harsh. And whilst Ukraine has success in some parts of the battleground, they are really in trouble in other parts. So on one side, he needs more help. And if he's not getting that, he's in a difficult situation. The whole country is in a difficult situation. But on the other hand, there is not really an understanding from either the Ukrainian leadership or the population, like, for example, in the city where I'm at now, to understand that how can we talk about a ceasefire? Because a ceasefire just means that Russia just will attack us later on, like they did here in February after a war that broke out back in 2014, and where there has been plenty of ceasefires, but that did not prevent what happened in February.
Stefan Weichert, thank you ever so much for coming on the programme. Do stay safe, and we'll catch up again very soon. Well, political writer and commentator Benedict Spence is still with me. It seems to me that what's happening here is this is falling down in the run order on news programmes. We're not so interested in hearing about Ukraine anymore. Same old, while we're gripped by a cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, Putin knows what he's doing. He's blocking the grain shipments coming out of Ukraine to trigger a big food crisis and food shortages and create instability. He's looting that grain. He's making sure that fuel prices continue to go up and up and up, knowing that in the end, leaders are going to have to pick between looking after their people or looking after Ukraine.
Ultimately, this is costing the West an awful lot of money. That's just the way to look at it. And this isn't just about Germany not getting its oil and gas supplies. This is in terms of the sanctions that we've placed on Russia. Many of them, far too late in the day, are hurting us just as much as they're hurting the Russian economy. We're sending them all kinds of weapons, and in some cases, some countries are pledging to, but not, because they realise actually that's going to cost them a lot of money as well. And they are looking at this as something of a forlorn campaign. And we have to remember, actually, this was always the reality. I remember coming on your show when this first started and saying, actually, this doesn't look good. And every couple of weeks, we've been hearing reports saying, oh, actually, Ukraine is doing really well. Ukraine might even win. That's never really been the case. A tactical retreat by the Russians from Kiev and Kharkiv because they slightly messed up the result doesn't mean, actually, that Ukraine was ever doing particularly well. If this was going to be about Ukraine being liberated, winning the war, it was going to have to involve all of Ukraine's sovereign territory, not bits of it being ceded. That was going to cost a staggering amount of money. It was going to cost an awful lot of lives. And the feeling I have is that actually most Western leaders, with the exception maybe of the UK, 3 of the 4 Visegrad countries and the Baltics, they've never really had the stomach for the fight. They don't want this fight. Actually, they want to live nice, quiet, peaceful, wealthy lives. Europe has become very sort of pacified. Many might say that's a very good thing over the last few decades, but nonetheless, we don't understand really what Vladimir Putin is, or we do understand, and we're not prepared to actually put up the resistance to him. And this will, I'm afraid, this will come back to harm the rest of Europe, not just Ukraine. If we give portions of land to the Russians, eventually all of Ukraine will be subsumed into Russia. It might take decades, but that is what's going to happen. And we will all be put under the cosh of Russia's economic impact to the world. For so long, we like to laugh and say, oh, it has an economy the size of Portugal. Well, that's all very well, except that it controls everything that it does. Rare earths, fertilizers, grain, and of course oil and gas, which none of us can survive without, and which most of the rest of the world can't survive without, which is why they haven't even bothered with the piecemeal sanctions. This, I'm afraid, was always going to be the case. Either we are going to go hell for leather against them, and that's going to make us all a lot poorer, or we have to say, Ukraine is on its own and it will lose. And I know that that's not a very popular thing, but that ultimately is, without saying it out loud, what France and Germany are basically trying to concede.
I agree. Lots of eyes watching this, knowing that if you don't oppose a bully, you essentially appease him. 2 million people face domestic abuse every year, yet only 1 in 5 report it to police. with many of those reluctant to seek help coming from closed communities and cultures, often the victims of what the government labels honour abuse. Heartbreaking headlines of the cruel killings of children, Arthur Labinjo Hughes and Star Hobson, shocked the nation and should surely have provoked a serious overhaul of the way we identify and safeguard the most vulnerable. Well, a report out today lays bare many of the horrific crimes being carried out inside people's homes, from female infanticide, forced marriage, forced abortion to rape, and calls on the government to seriously review its strategy to deal with domestic abuse. Well, Dr. Akibe San is a senior data analyst at the Centre for Social Justice, the organisation behind that new report, and he joins me now. Dr. Akibe, fantastic to have you on the programme. I mean, some really harrowing statistics there. Perhaps not surprising that we learn of the amount of abuse going on in households that aren't necessarily integrated into British culture and therefore have an inherent fear about coming forwards.
Well, I think that the report published by my organisation, the Centre for Social Justice, the CSJ, it reveals the true scale of the domestic abuse problem in modern day Britain. But Alex, as you say, many of those problems are within those closed off, segregated communities. You talk about that term, honour abuse. I've never been a fan of that term. And our report condemns that because what it does, it runs the risk of legitimising those violent practices, those mentally abusive practices. And it ultimately prioritises the viewpoint of the perpetrator over the victim. So what we're calling for, one of our main recommendations, is that the government bins that phrase from police and medical records, because ultimately it runs the risk of glamorizing what I would consider to be violent practices that have no place in a civilized society.
So where are things going wrong? I mean, staggering numbers there. Is it the fact that perhaps in certain elements of public service that things are being missed because people aren't being trained properly, or things are being missed because they actually don't know how to handle what they're seeing?
Well, I think that's a really good point that you make there, Alex. I think that there needs to be the introduction of statutory training for health professionals. You mentioned that statistic earlier that under 1 in 5 victims of domestic abuse report their experiences to the police, which is a quite astonishing figure. They're more likely to report their experiences to health-related professionals, GPs, midwives, health visitors. But those health professionals, they need greater training in order to bolster the identification of domestic abuse victims and perpetrators, and then those victims can be referred to the appropriate services. So what we need a multi-agency joined up approach to tackle domestic abuse in our local communities.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard this before, haven't we? Certainly after the horrific murder of the 2 children I mentioned in my introduction, Arthur Labinjo Hughes and Star Hobson. And we've had a big outcry saying that social services are not necessarily reporting things or dealing with things correctly, that agencies aren't talking to one another, things are slipping through the net. So really, what can be done to strengthen our system and make sure these horrors just don't happen again?
But one point that I would like to make is that we need to have more face-to-face consultations. And I think that over the course of the pandemic, we obviously saw many of those processes being moved into the virtual space, e-consultations. But that's definitely a problem from a domestic abuse perspective, because there's certain indicators of domestic abuse which can be more easily detected through in-person consultations, but they may go undetected during virtual e-consultations. So what we need more of those face-to-face consultations. We need a more joined-up approach, and ultimately organisations such as NHS England, Department of Health and Social Care, they need to hammer home the point, Alex, that this toxic mixture of identity politics and political correctness, there's no place for it when it comes to tackling domestic abuse in our society.
Dr. Akibe San, thank you ever so much. Senior data analyst at the Centre for Social Justice, who put together that pretty harrowing report. Benedict, I mean, you know, we hear again and again, don't we? It's the failure between agencies working together. And when you hear Rakib there saying that, you know, healthcare workers need to be more adept at identifying things and dealing with things, I'm there thinking to myself, in backlog Britain, we just need more healthcare workers.
healthcare workers are asked to do an awful lot of things, it must be said, and I think given that they also need to have an in-depth knowledge of human anatomy and biology, I think, also asking them to have things like, sort of sensitivity training or to look out for different signs. Yes, in an ideal world, that would be wonderful, but there is only so much that you can do. And as you point out, especially seeing as we live in a country where people struggle to see their GPs unless they are retirees and can wait around all day. Yeah, and of course there are so many different types, aren't there? Be it, the example of Arthur Libindio, who's that you mentioned, or sort of honour-related abuse that you see in certain communities in the UK. There are so many different aspects to needing to sort of see the lookouts for abuse. It's just very difficult. And again, the fear is, as you say, we need more healthcare workers. That means even more money for the NHS, which is already incredibly bloated and doesn't work effectively. So again, my big fear there is the response really going to be that we just need to throw more money at this? Where there are lots of different things that, for example, abuse cases have gone up during lockdown, for example, especially amongst lots of children. Is that not simply the case of that needs to be something that is dealt with in schools? And is it not a great big sort of warning sign to the rest of us that actually closing the schools was one of the worst things we could have done? On the subject of honour killings, for example, I read a very interesting paper a couple of months ago about why it is that communities that move abroad stick to things like the Pashtunwali, for example, communities that come from Pakistan, because they don't trust local authorities. There needs to be a build-up of trust, and also not fears that if you say something wrong, you'll be called a racist. There needs to be much more stringent integration. There are things that we can do, and I do feel that if the response is just it's healthcare workers that need to look at things like that, you're asking them to do far too much. They've already got a lot on their plate.
Benedict, thank you. Well, it's that part of the show where I get to grouch and gripe about the worst of the 21st century, yet celebrate the small victorious moments of progress. Because I, like everyone else, hates to say, I told you so. But I did, and actually I don't. It's time for the strangely titled segment where I refer to myself in the third person, the Alex Agenda. Oh, how the whiners opined that students wouldn't be able to study abroad because of Brexit, and Britain was pulling up the drawbridge to talent. Wrong and wrong again. The number of foreign undergrads coming here has soared to 600,000, hitting the government's targets 10 years early, while a record number of Brits are going abroad under the Turing programme, which replaced the EU's Erasmus scheme, with 150 countries to study in around the world. And surprise, surprise, the majority of British students choose America, Canada and Australia, while the brightest and the best from the Anglosphere flock here. And where are the world's top 100 universities, I hear you ask? The top 10 is entirely British and American, with the exception of Switzerland, while the EU's minor offering only starts at 44th place, with the UK alone almost doubling the number of celebrated universities than the bloc. Well, Priti Patel has announced today work visas for the biggest geeks studying here, regardless of where they are from, in response, no doubt, to the EU booting the UK out of Horizon, the joint science scheme when we said we'd bin the worst parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Or we've also scrapped a load of EU restrictions on research and innovation, proving we always have been and always will be at the forefront of progress and a petri dish of excellence. And you've doubtless read that imperial measures are coming back. That's right. As we inch towards our post-Brexit freedom, units that shopkeepers weren't allowed to touch with a yardstick are now going to be pound for pound alongside metric measurements. Whichever you think is miles better than the other, let's raise a pint to Blighty finally finding its feet again. But it did make us all discuss in the newsroom which measurements we use and for what, with many of us trapped in a weird hybrid approach. For me, cooking is in ounces, height is in feet, but I do weigh myself in kilos. Meanwhile, isn't it strange that some measurements are always given in imperial, particularly intimate body parts, despite the number being far lower? Well, that's all I've got time for today. Join me again for We Need to Talk About on GB News at the same time, 2 o'clock tomorrow. Coming up next, it's The Briefing with Darren McCaffrey. First, though, it's time for a check on the weather forecast. Bye-bye.
Hello, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather update. Plenty of showers across the country today. Some sunny spells around as well, but it's not particularly warm for the end of May. Low pressure is in control of our weather. It's a fairly slow-moving area of low pressure. Not a lot of isobars on the chart, which means the winds are light, which means the showers are slow-moving, so you can get stuck under the showers for quite a while through the afternoon, particularly parts of eastern England, Northern England, southern Scotland and northeast Scotland. Elsewhere, the showers are a bit more hit and miss, so again, because they're fairly slow moving, you may stay largely dry and bright with a bit of sunshine. Temperatures could creep into the high teens, but for most, we're low to mid-teens at best, feeling cooler, particularly if you get caught in a downpour. There'll be plenty of those around, and we'll still keep those heavy showers through the evening. They'll slowly start to fade, certainly across parts of East Anglia and the southeast, and for parts of the Midlands and southwest England.